going to go back to one of Amazon's leadership principles. One of the ones that Jeff Bezos had was leaders are right. That's kind of an arrogant point of view, but if you read what their description of that is, as a leader, your work product is decisions. If your decisions aren't usually good, you're not going to be a very effective leader, in the same way that if you're a software engineer and most of your code is buggy, you're not a very good software engineer.
In today's episode of Inside the Silicon Mind, we're excited to welcome Spence Green. Spence is the CEO and co-founder of LILT, an AI-powered translation company helping enterprises communicate across languages. He earned his PhD in computer science at Stanford, where he focused on machine translation and natural language processing, and has been working in AI and language technologies ever since. Today, he leads LILT in building cutting-edge translation solutions, combining research with real-world impact. In this episode, we dive into AI's transformative impact on technology, the value of hands-on leadership, and why Silicon Valley remains an unparalleled hub for innovation.
What was it about ChatGPT that in many ways took it to the masses and everybody realized the potential of what AI or machine learning is?
I think technology shifts happen when computers do things that are surprising to people.
Spence, with AI reshaping how we work and live, we're at a moment of profound transformation in technology. Do you think we're entering an era where leadership matters more than ever, or one where technology itself takes the lead?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you. The short answer is yes. I think leadership is more important than ever, but it's the type of leadership. I think the reason for that is we're in a moment of profound behavior change, and behavior change is, new habit forming is very difficult for people. I think that at least within technology, but maybe broadly in other sectors of the economy, the era of the air traffic controller type leader of, just sort of redirecting resources is maybe not as valuable anymore. And I think player coach leadership at the CEO level in public companies is what the moment requires. Me personally, like every founder I know, is like in the weeds. I mean, I started writing code again 3 or 4 months ago after having not written code for 5 years. So I think the moment calls for being very close to what people are doing, whether that's working on your own product or getting teams in your company to adopt new ways of working. It just requires an enormous amount. It requires energetic leadership and an enormous amount of example setting, coaching and behavior change, I think.
Well, firstly, Spence, thank you for being on the show. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. It's an interesting one because I'm hearing this a lot. What do you think has changed that has now in many ways put leaders like yourself in a position where you're going back to the code, that player coach approach is becoming far more prominent in the market?
I'm not a psychologist or an anthropologist, so I don't have evidence to support this, but I just think the rate of change in technology is probably greater than what we're neurologically wired for. I think everybody's just kind of redlined in how fast AI is moving, how fast businesses are changing established modes of working and rewiring workflows that maybe have been the way they've been for 20 years, probably at least since the 90s, since the advent of the broad deployment of microcomputers and internet connectivity, probably the biggest rewiring of the way people work since in 30 years. So most, the professional working lifetime of like basically everybody we know. That's a big shift. And I think at that time, as like even tell our leaders, at that time, if you were a leader in a company, you probably had like a secretary and you didn't know how to type and you didn't know how to use a computer and you were having somebody like print out your emails, and like everybody had to learn how to type, everybody had to learn how to use a computer, everybody had to learn how to use a word processor. I'm sure that was probably challenging for people at that time. Now we're in a moment where, leaders know how to use Gmail and Calendar and PowerPoint and maybe a couple of other things, and they've got to suddenly get in there and start rewiring workflows using AI and automation. And to get that to happen, you have to set an example, which means you have to be proficient in the technology yourself. That's a big change when we've got other pressures that we're trying to manage, which are, economic pressures, geopolitical pressures. Yeah, there's a lot going on right now.
It really is. It really is. As far as what I'm seeing, the people that I've had on this show, founders, investors, they're all saying the same thing. It's a unique change. Some are remembering it as close back to the internet age being the most, obviously there was cloud, there was mobile. As you described, we're all changing the way we work. It makes you think that the kids coming into the workforce in 10 or 15, 20 years, they'll look back at what we were doing and things very ancient and legacy. But as far as the leader's concerned, and we'll touch on your company and what you're doing and how you're impacting change in the industry. But as far as the leader is concerned, taking that player coach approach, how does that in your organization, how does it benefit the business internally? How do your team react to the changes you're making in your leadership?
Fundamentally, so again, we're in technology. So fundamentally, technology companies are about the product. And if you're going to make a big change to the product, I think that founders have a unique ability to be able to cut through the standard way that decisions are made, which is consensus orientation. I kind of tell our team there's a reason when countries go to war, they institute martial law. Like there's a place for bottoms up decision making and there's a place for top down decision making. And if what you're optimizing on is speed, then that calls for, energetic and command oriented leadership, not authoritarianism, but certainly an opinionated point of view that we're going to go a certain direction. And that's a risk because that might be the wrong direction. But I think to succeed right now, the burden is on the leader to say this is the direction we're going to go and get everybody going in that direction. And that I think founders have unique moral authority in their ability to be able to do that. And I think that's what's required to be successful right now. If you need to really change how your product works. And I mean, we're an AI company and we have changed fundamentally how our product works. That's why I kind of went back to writing code and convening a group of people to work on the future of our product because our roadmap is completely different now than it was 6 months ago. And that's a big shift.
I'd like to double click on the decision-making piece. You said, decision can sometimes be wrong and you've got to be operating at speed, especially with how the market is moving. When you think about your decision-making process as a founder and as a CEO, how has that changed today from what it was before?
I always feel like for me personally, wartime is more comfortable than peacetime. I don't do very well. I think I'm not my best in peacetime because I think that calls for more a focus on stability and predictability and consensus orientation. My perspective on leadership is, I was going to go back to one of Amazon's leadership principles. One of the ones that people talk about customer obsession and stuff, but one of the ones that Jeff Bezos had was leaders are right. And you think that's kind of an arrogant point of view. But if you read what their description of that is, it's like, as a leader, your work product is decisions. If your decisions aren't usually good, then you're not going to be a very effective leader. In the same way that if you're a software engineer and most of your code is buggy, well, you're not you're not a very good software engineer. Or you're a salesperson and most of your deals don't close, then you're not a very good salesperson. So, as a leader, your decisions are your work product. And if they're usually not very good, then you probably shouldn't be in leadership. And so, I think ultimately you have to make these decisions and then the uncomfortable truth is that the buck stops with you. And if your decisions are right, then that'll show in the results. And if they're not, that'll also show in the results. I personally prefer to be in that place and be able to move quickly and make adjustments than move slower and spend a lot more time on deliberation.
I think I might have seen a quote, or at least a interview with Bezos, where he describes how, as a leader, you make a set number of decisions a year, perhaps let's say 100. If you get a certain percentage of those right, you've done a good job.
That's correct. That's the same when he talks about that a lot. He talks about one-way doors and two-way doors. And the two-way doors are, most of those 100 decisions, 98 of them are two-way doors. That means you can make the decision and you can back out of it if it doesn't turn out to be a correct decision. And then 2 of those 98 are one-way doors. And so you're going to go that direction and you can't go back. I think a lot of people confuse one-way and two-way doors. The two-way doors you should just make very fast and then you should make adjustments. The one-way doors you should take more time to deliberate over. More often than not, the two get confused and, an organization will spend a bunch of time on a two-way door when you can just make it and walk backwards and not spend enough time on the one-way door. I've certainly made that mistake and we have made that mistake as a leadership team too.
So you're saying that there are options there where you can make a decision, you can get out of it very quickly. In those situations, speed and velocity is key. And there's decisions that once you've made them, there's no going back. And those are the ones you've got to do your due diligence and think about. How do you differentiate between the two? For our listeners, what's an example of a two-way door decision and a one-way door?
If I think of the big ones that we made in the history of the company, and we can get into what our company does, but, an example of a one-way door decision that we made a number of of years ago is, well, what we do is we say what we call solving multilingual for large enterprise, meaning you have a large business and it needs to communicate with its customers, users, and suppliers in different markets around the world. And that means communicating in other languages. And usually there's a quality standard that you have to meet. So my co-founder and I met working on Google Translate. For lots of use cases, you can use Google Translate. But if you're going to submit something to a regulator or a contract for an international lawsuit, or you're going to put a product on your website, usually you want to know that the output of the AI system is correct. And the best way to do that is to have some human experts doing supervision of the output. When we started the business, we were a pure technology company. We said we weren't going to do any human operations and just stay a software company. We quickly found that we couldn't solve the customer problem unless we managed people ourselves. And so we chose to do that. And that was a big decision for our company because it fundamentally changed our business model, who we hired, how we went to market, how we built our product. It wasn't one that we could really unwind very easily. Whereas I think, a lot of times putting, say, a feature in your product or something like that, you spend a bunch of time deliberating what it should look like and talking to a bunch of customers and all this sort of stuff. And that's all good. But I think what's really awesome about vibe coding is what you really want to get to is an actual product that people can use and get feedback on it and then just start iterating. And so I think spend a bunch of time, deliberating over what a specific part of a product should do. And instead, it's more often better than not just get it out there and start to get feedback on it.
We're in the intersection of talking about the company. So let's talk about LILT. You are building a very successful startup.
We're a pre-AI company, which is a
I know, it's pretty cool.
Unique and interesting place to be.
Funny you say that because I had Varun, the founder and CEO of Endor Labs, on the show recently. And, the timing of these companies right now, like yours, AI has come in and in many ways amplified what you're doing because you're solving now a bigger market problem. Let's talk about LILT. So when was the company founded? You're the founder. Who's the co-founder? Who you're backed by? How big is the company? What problem are you solving?
Yeah, so let's start with the problem. That's the most important thing and the mission that we have. So what we do, I think I mentioned this earlier, is for an organization, usually large organizations that have a need to communicate in global markets. So they want to go to market, they want to deal with suppliers, they want to deal with users. We make it possible for them to do that with AI. And so our business has three parts. One is core product and service localization. So this is making websites and products and documents and videos available in other languages with a quality guarantee. The second we call multilingual AI solutions. So this is making AI systems capable in other languages. So businesses that are building chatbots, foundation model providers that are making their models more capable. We work with them. And the third we call government solutions, which is governments have a slightly different problem, which is primarily for intelligence, they're collecting information in other languages and they need to distill that down into intelligence products that they can use for decision making. And so our combination of software and human experts solves those three problems. My co-founder and I met working on Google Translate. We're both research scientists. I have a PhD from Stanford and worked in the AI lab, and my co-founder has a PhD from Berkeley and worked in the AI lab there. We met working on Google Translate, and we felt like the consumer problem, the sort of the multilingual consumer problem, was going to be solved by a phone with an earpiece or a Neuralink or something like that. And that was even clear 8 years ago or so. And what we got excited about was solving that problem for an organization. So the sort of piece of software infrastructure that would make an organizational entity that has to communicate, making it able to operate across language barriers as well. And historically, that is done entirely by professional services, by people. You need to go, give a presentation in Japan, you find somebody who speaks Japanese and they help you get your PowerPoint presentation in Japanese, and then you go give your presentation. So we wanted to do that with AI, and the real difference between a fully automatic system is you've got to have some type of a quality guarantee. There are more complicated workflows in businesses where you have approval processes with legal. We have to solve some enterprise grade problems to make that possible. But we started the company right at around 10 years ago. It took us about a year to get the product working right. And then we had a really big pivot in 2018 when we started doing human operations ourselves. And I would say the first 7, 8 years of the company were really an uphill slog because a lot of businesses had used human professional services for decades, and there was no reason to change from doing that. We're in a very large kind of laggard, stodgy market. It's about a $30 billion a year market. And then ChatGPT really changed that. And, going back to our discussion about leadership, suddenly there was this like top-down mandate from the CEO and the CTO that find all the areas of our business that we can automate with AI. Well, this has been a great one for a decade. That's sort of why we started the company. But there was no real mandate to make this part of the business change. Our business has been great since ChatGPT happened. But the common assumption is that like any company founded before ChatGPT, like can't possibly have a chance. And I guess we have one existence proof of one company that's not true.
Let's go from the beginning, because part of this show, Inside Silicon Mind, is to get into the mind of Silicon Valley leaders, founders, investors, CEOs, CTOs, and our listeners and our viewers would love to hear the stories from the beginning, where it all started. So going back 10 years ago, how did you meet your co-founder? How did you think about this problem as worth solving? And then just the picture of what was it like putting together, whether it's deck or whether you built a MVP and going out there and speaking to investors. What was that journey like in the beginning?
Like I said, my co-founder and I met on Google Translate, and we noticed the problem when we went and talked to the teams responsible for multilingual communication at Google, and they didn't use Google Translate. And that seemed shocking and odd to us. Why would that be? And the reason was that basically a couple different reasons. One, you need AI models that are customized to the business use case. So if you take a general domain model and you apply it to, say, legal documents or very technical documents about a medical device, it won't work nearly as well as just like a general web page on the internet. So you got to solve model specialization. You need a contractual guarantee of accuracy and correctness. That usually comes from a human being. So you've got to figure out how to get that. And then you have a workflow problem too, because businesses have data stored in lots of different locations. And you've got to be able to pull that data out, run it through a workflow with possibly multiple production and approval steps. Like it may need to go look by legal, it may need to go by a brand creative, and then it needs to be published back into wherever it's going to be distributed and published to customers. So it's this general idea of publication grade content that businesses produce we wanted to solve. In my PhD days, I worked on two things. I worked on model customization, so customizing AI models based on human feedback. And then I worked on human in the loop systems. So like the interfaces that you use to have a person interact with an AI system so that you can collect feedback from a person. So this seemed like kind of a natural fit. I kind of credit my doctoral advisor, Chris Manning. A couple of years into my work, he said, your work's really applied. You might think about starting a company after you finish. And so I started working with a seed investor, and I would go sit in pitch meetings and listen to other founders pitch and be as sort of like a subject matter expert about AI. And then we started over the course of about 2 years of working at a seed venture firm, which I was just doing part-time when I was in grad school. We worked on the idea to try to decide whether it was a reasonable thing to, start a business to do, and convinced ourselves that it was. And then he wrote me a check when I graduated from grad school, and that was our first amount of money. It was $650,000. I had never seen that much money in my life. So it shows you how much, people are raising like, I don't know, whatever, $20 million seed rounds now. So it shows how much things have changed in the last 10 years since we started.
What was that like going back 10 years ago? And thinking about today, hindsight is 2020. But when you look back, the successes you've had, and when you're solving a problem that you truly believe in and you see the fruition of it, going back 10 years and looking to where you are now, how does it feel?
I can kind of look at it two different ways. I mean, I'm kind of close to the product right now. And so there's either code that I wrote 10 years ago or like sort of design decisions that I made that are still present in the product. And, I guess when you're close to engineers feel this way, you kind of are close to a system that you've worked on. Maybe it's like building a house or something like that. It doesn't feel like 10 years ago that, I chose that door or something like that. You kind of live with these decisions that you make, and that doesn't seem like that long ago. But if I reflect on the organizational journey that we have been on with many twists and turns, the different leaders that have come into the business, and then the way in which I've changed over the past 10 years, well, it just seems like a different lifetime ago. And the way Silicon Valley has changed, the way, venture has changed, and the way starting companies has changed, it seems like a very different time.
We'll come back to that in a second. I'd like to go back to LILT. Is language an underestimated driver in business? And if so, why?
I think it is. And you can convince yourself of this if you look at the number of people that work in marketing. What do marketing people do? They spend an enormous amount of time trying to figure out what's the right turn of phrase put on the ad, or the right thing to put on the website, or the right product segmentation and how to describe each part of a product to get people to buy it and differentiate it. And that's all manipulation of language. If it was easy or it didn't matter very much, then you wouldn't have a bunch of people spending a huge amount of time manipulating words to fundamentally differentiate their business from somebody else's business. Now, I think there are areas where it's maybe less strategically important. Like, is it important that, every customer support communication that you have is like worded perfectly? Well, probably not. Does it matter if you're in a legal dispute, getting the words right? If you're dealing with a regulator, getting the words right? If you're in the government and you're trying to decide whether you need something as a threat or it isn't, well, then language matters a lot.
Yeah. What does the total addressable market look like for the products that you're building?
Our market's about $50 billion a year, and it's approximately half what we call interpretation. So this is speech to speech. This is like, you go into the hospital and you speak Tagalog and the doctor speaks English, and you need somebody to help interpret between the two. So it's half interpretation, and it's half, I guess, what I would broadly call publication. So this is speech, video, and text that's going to be published by a business, whether that's a website or a document or a video or any sort of publication grade content.
Since AI has come into play, how has it changed how you think about LILT?
This is kind of interesting. So I think the most exciting thing are agents. And I want to talk about what I mean specifically by that, because I think there's still a lot of different things that are labeled agents. But, the classical definition of an agent from computer science is a system that has agency, meaning it can make decisions. I think what we learned very early on in our business, we thought, we'll just make a great language model that's customized to a business, problem solved. Like, if we can just make a language model that's customized to marketing at this company, then we'll beat Google Translate and we'll beat all of these human service providers that we deal with, and we'll just win. And what we learned very quickly was that's not how business works. In business, you have workflows, which means you have teams of people working together versus individuals doing a transactional task. And workflows are why we have enterprise software. Enterprise software, whether it's Salesforce or Zendesk or whatever, it's basically solving a coordination problem. It coordinates teams of people doing things. And for multilingual stuff, these workflows get very complicated. We used to have this chart, this workflow diagram we showed in a board meeting, and like the translation box where the AI model was working was like down here, and the entire slide was filled with all these other production steps and all these links between them to turn, a video in one language into 30 videos in 30 other languages, each of which is correct. Those workflow steps are, if you're just writing deterministic software, a bunch of if-then statements to decide what to do, it gets really, really complicated, and it differs across businesses, which poses a product design. With agents, this is like the most amazing thing I've seen in software since I started writing code 25 years ago. You can use the agent as the workflow engine. So you basically use the agent as the workflow engine. Your system becomes a series of tools for the agent to do jobs, and the agent's job is to translate between what the user wants to do and a sequence of tool calls in your platform, and then you can just generate the interface that they need to do that job. And so that's what I mean by complete rewiring and re-architecting of our system. And so I think the way this works now, and you see this in products like Cursor and others, you have an orchestration of models solving a problem. You have maybe you use a frontier model for the workflow orchestration, and then you use a series of custom models for very specific tasks to do different things. And you can build your software as a model orchestration calling a bunch of different tools. So I think that fundamentally changes how we build enterprise software, because we can start to build very, very adaptable workflows to whatever the business need is. And we don't have to turn our product into this gigantic feature factory, which is what tends to happen. Like, why does enterprise software get bloated? It's not because it's like built by stupid people or something like that. It's because you start trying to sell to bigger and bigger businesses, and they have more and more bespoke requirements. You try to fit all of that into your product, and then it just turns into this big bloated piece of software. And I think agents are going to fundamentally change that.
How?
It's the way that you architect the software. So instead of having to build a bunch of business logic that has a bunch of conditionals and a bunch of complexity, you can take, when actually what people want to do is, like, if we were to open up Salesforce right now and I would say, my intention is to update an opportunity in Salesforce. I've got to like click here and click over here and click this button and click this drop down and click this other thing and go through this whole basic decision tree to do that. Whereas I can just say, what I really want to do is update the opportunity for, inside the Silicon Mind and change the deal size to 15K or something. And then the agent could turn that into a sequence of tool calls to execute in the software and just do that for me.
Right.
And you don't have to build this whole complicated interface and all this business logic to make that happen.
That is a game changer. We use a CRM that's designed for recruitment, because obviously we've got a recruitment business. And if I was to add a new job on the system, there's probably, as you were saying, I was thinking there's probably like 10 or 15 different clicks I have to make just to add the job on the system, versus just saying, I've just finished a call with a client, click a button, this is what I need to do, and it does it for me.
Yeah, that's right. And the bigger your company is, you're running a small organization, I assume. Now you're running a 100,000 person organization. It gets, exponentially more complicated at that scale, which is why enterprise software gets so complicated. So I think we're going to be able to build software that's much more adaptable to each use case. This has been a real rate limiter in our growth. We can't go into certain segments of the market because even though it's, translation or dubbing and subtitling of videos, the way that that's done for legal use cases is different than the way you do it for life sciences use cases. As an emerging company, you basically got to pick. But if you can describe, you can just make sure that you have all of the tools that you need to do the job in those two cases. Like if you want to build a skyscraper, you want to build a house, you still need hammers and bolts and, stuff like that. For the skyscraper, you need like cranes and other things, but some of the basic tools are the same. You need hammers and wrenches and bolts and stuff like that. And if you can build all of the basic tools in your platform, then you can use the LLM to deal with some of the business logic and workflow complexity.
One of the companies in our portfolio, which I hope they don't mind me mentioning them since they've just come out at stealth, is a company called Oracell, and they're doing exactly that. When I say exactly that, not construction, we'll talk about Salesforce and changing the game or CRMs. It kind of bodes another question. Why is it that companies like Salesforce, who are giants with huge amount of capital, why can't they reinvent themselves?
What I'm about to say is not a critique of any specific leader. The bigger the company, the more powerful the antibodies.
Right. Explain.
You could sort of look at like, why is it for most companies, the bigger they get, innovation really has to come from mergers and acquisitions. Why can't they just deploy their capital to build new product? And the reason for that is I think building new products requires, an absence of process, a little bit of non-consensus and contrarian decision-making. It's more open-ended, higher risk of failure. And the bigger a company gets, the more, people in the company tend to focus on keeping their job and not ruffling any feathers and, basically staying in line so that they can get the promotion to the next level. It's like a very different reward structure than innovation, which is why oftentimes big companies will, create like a subsidiary. They'll create like a lab or something like that, put people in a different organizational structure to go like do innovation, or they'll just buy a company. And so I think that's why it's challenging right now, because for a lot of software products, they've got to fundamentally change around these agents. And so you see in some businesses like founders leading in really, really hard to change how the business works.
This absolutely resonates with me because one of our first guests on the show was Scott Dietzen, and he said every startup aspires to be a legacy company.
It's true, isn't it? And every legacy company aspires to be a startup.
Yeah. Spence, moving on to not really moving on, but double clicking on the agents. Is your perspective on agents, is it hype cycle? Is it overhyped today and underhyped tomorrow?
I think it's underhyped. It's just a fundamental reworking of how we build software. I think everything is going to get rethought. Which programming languages we use, object orientation, the types of primitives you use, the way that software systems are architected, all of that can be rethought if, this sort of model view controller structural paradigm that we've had in software for 20 years now. You sort of think about it like the model used to be the database and that was it. Well, now it's a context database that's basically storing information for the purpose of populating the context window of a language model with some persistent, structured, and unstructured storage, but the way that you organize the database for the purposes of retrieval fundamentally changes. The view part, which used to be static, you would write your UI with your drop downs and your buttons and everything. You can generate a UI now. Like the system can generate the UI on demand. That's amazing. And then the controller part, which is the business logic, that used to be a bunch of right now that's a bunch of hardwired stuff, basically a bunch of if-then statements. Your example in the CRM, you can think about that like a decision tree. I am deciding to click this button, and then I'm deciding to click this button, and then I'm deciding to click this button. It's like a big tree. It's a decision tree. That controller part now is an AI system, which means that based on what you as a user want to do, it can decide what are the sequence of steps that need to happen. That's a fundamental change. And I think that was very difficult to see that coming. It's still odd for me to think about. When I was in grad school, if you were working on language models, that was like a dead area. Like you would never graduate working on that. So the fact that conditional language models are what we now regard as AI is, I think, very surprising to anybody who worked in AI, 5-6 years ago.
You said at the start of the call, an AI company predating AI.
Yeah.
When starting LILT, did you, at the time, especially with your educational background and what you studied and what you were doing and your co-founder, was this ultimately part of the plan? Was this very much linked that this was going to be an AI company? This was going to be driving in this direction, or how did it all kind of come together?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, so, in natural language processing, which is, our field, like one of the first applications of digital computers after the Second World War. So we got digital computers in the Second World War were used for two things. They were used for modeling nuclear explosions, and they were used for cryptography. And the original idea was, after the Second World War, that Russian was simply English encrypted in Cyrillic. And so if you could use the same code breaking tactics on computers, then you could decrypt Russian into English. And a lot of the early work in AI, you can tell the fields in AI that are old because they always start with machine. So there's machine translation, there's machine vision, there's machine learning. Those fields are very, very old. And people were working on machine translation in the early 1950s, which predates the 1956 conference that John McCarthy convened at Dartmouth, where he coined the term artificial intelligence. So actually working on digital translation predates the term artificial intelligence. And then, you had AI labs, like John McCarthy was at Stanford and Stanford AI Lab in the early 1970s. And then people working on different types of AI. In those days, they were knowledge-based systems, meaning they were complicated decision systems. You would basically write down a bunch of rules. And that's how AI systems worked. And I think Google Translate, when Google Translate in 2006, they moved from a knowledge-based system, which was basically a grammar. It was a bunch of rules that said this word in Russian translates to this word in English, to a data-oriented system where you take a big corpus of data and you learn a language model based on that. That change happened in 2006. And so that system, I think, was the first large-scale AI system that many of us encountered. I mean, certainly, machine learning was used in, say, fraud prevention and, like PayPal in the early days and at credit card companies. And then we were interacting with recommendation systems. Google obviously came out of the Stanford AI Lab. So Google was fundamentally an approach to search that was AI-oriented, using data-oriented algorithms to rank search results. Google Translate was really the first sort of generative AI system that many of us encountered that was trained in this way of taking a large corpus of text and learning a language model over the top of that and then using that to solve a problem. I went to Stanford to work on AI. I think many of us who were working on AI in those days had an uncomfortable relationship with the term AI. I didn't really use it until about 2 years ago. I just sort of capitulated. I found it to be an odd term to use, and so I always preferred machine learning. Training probabilistic systems on data is what modern AI is. And in fact, the Transformer paper in 2017, so the T in ChatGPT, the underlying model that everybody uses, the Transformer model, that paper is a translation paper. That is the task that they chose to apply the Transformer to in the first place. And so there's a long history of this problem of converting one language to another using machines as being a core problem that people have worked on in AI.
This is super fascinating. It kind of brings me to another area which I'm really keen to get your perspective on, which is this has been around such a long time, right? We're talking about the 50s, and you've been studying this for a long time. You started a business in the area. ChatGPT comes out, and all of a sudden, AI is new. It's not really new.
AI's been new many times. The first time somebody saw it 10 years ago, AI was a self-driving car, and then everybody decided that didn't work until, now they see a Waymo and they're like, oh, but they don't think that's AI. They think that's like a robot or something like this. AI is now ChatGPT. AI is this like moving target,
But this is the reason why I wanted to ask you about the hype. Now, it's not necessarily that it's not such an important transformation in our industry, and it's definitely a movement to something completely profound, and it's impacting everything, literally everything. But it's been around. I mean, in tech, in technology, in, leaders in the industry like yourself. Till today, when I get into a Waymo, I'm like, this is crazy. This is incredible what was happening here.
Yeah.
But as you said, ChatGPT comes out. What was it about ChatGPT that in many ways took it to the masses and everybody realized the potential of what AI or machine learning is?
I think technology shifts happen when computers do things that are surprising to people. I remember the first time I used Google. I was sitting in the library in college in 2000. We got a computer in 1994. And so I was like 12, 13 years old. We got a computer. I saw how to program and, there were like 30 different search engines at that time. There was like WebCrawler and AltaVista and Lycos, and there were tons of them, right? And they didn't work. You would like search for something and you get all these results and they didn't work at all. And then the first time you used Google, you would search for something, you got exactly what you were looking for. And it was like quite shocking. I mean, I remember gasping when it happened. Or the first time you use an Uber and you like click a few buttons on your phone and then like a car shows up. Like, that's odd. You can like control your environment with your phone. I think that's what made mobile a profound breakthrough for people, is you could just click some buttons and like environment around you manipulate, or like your lunch shows up or something. I mean, it's amazing. But then interacting with a machine in natural language, I think, was profoundly shocking for a lot of people. So I think that's what catalyzed this technology shift. And, really the dream of early artificial intelligence was machines that communicate in natural language. I mean, we've had this sort of artificial formal paradigm of communicating with silicon, which is a programming language, and that's inaccessible to most people. So engineers have been able to communicate with silicon for a long time, software engineers, but the average person has not been able to communicate with silicon in their own natural language. And then suddenly they could. And I think that was shocking for a lot of people. It was basically an alien encounter. I mean, you sort of think about it, like if an alien landed and they walked out of the spaceship speaking English, that's basically what happened.
Yeah, because we were, Hollywood has told us that's not the case. Silicon Valley, it's incredible, right? What happens here is absolutely profound. Technology shifts, everything that I sort of think about today, and even the show, I called it Inside Silicon Mind, because getting into the minds of people like yourself and understanding what makes this place tick, what makes it so special, what makes it a place where the greatest minds come and capital's available.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that? Why is it this is such a unique place in the world?
I think there are two reasons for it. One is the weather. I actually think that's part of it. That's not my idea. I heard Eric Schmidt say that one time, and I was like, I think that's right. So I think the weather's part of it. I think the other part of it is, so I grew up on the East Coast of the United States. I grew up in Atlanta, and I went to school on the East Coast, and, I was always like a really good student. So I'd always get very good grades. And so I come to Stanford, and the first midterm that I took, I got a 42 on. I never failed a test in my life. I got a 42. And the average was like 45 or something like this. So they just like make the test so hard that basically everybody fails. Like a couple of people got like a 95 or 100. So the reason you do that is because then you see like who the outliers are.
Yeah.
And clearly I was not an outlier. So, But the point is, there's something about the West Coast where you don't want to fail. I think this sort of like a failure is okay is like not quite the right attitude, but it's not the end of your life if you do fail. And I think that's unique. Maybe that comes out of the counterculture in the 1960s that was San Francisco since the 1840s, 1850s has been a place in the United States where eclectic people go. It's always attracted the sort of the nonconformist counterculture people. And so there's something about that in the Bay Area that's deeply rooted in the culture, that you can take risks. And if those risks don't pan out, you're not going to be like ostracized from society or something if that happens. I think you combine that with the financial infrastructure that's here, the risk capital that's here, and you get a very unique environment that I guess so far has been difficult to reproduce elsewhere.
I think it was slightly attempted during the pandemic, but people still realizing.
Yeah, people went to Miami, and like I think it's
Austin.
too hot there, like your brain bakes or something like this. And you go to Austin, and like maybe the capital infrastructure is not quite there or something, so it's just like London is like quite good, actually. I think we have an office there, and it's definitely not Silicon Valley, but it's like it's closer, and so I think it's the weather, and then I think it's the influence of the countercultural influence that goes back to the 60s, and there's some combination of those two things that makes it work.
A few weeks ago, I was in the Bay Area, beginning to plan my move back to the Bay Area. I was staying at this hotel. I went downstairs to the lobby. I bumped into somebody that I've been trying to speak with for 7 years. I've sent emails to this person. I've sent emails to this person. I've tried everything. I gave up. Like, even for a recruiter who follows up 100 times, I just gave up. Oh, this is never going to happen. And I bumped into him. There is something else that's super unique about, in my opinion, at least someone who's coming from the UK, from London, about America, but specifically Silicon Valley for me, is serendipity, but also this real genuine interest in working together in relation, which I think is quite special. So it's near impossible to achieve that, I believe, at least in tech anywhere else, but in Silicon Valley, the ability just to bump into somebody in a coffee shop or in a hotel lobby. So that's my opinion of it. I think the serendipity piece is pretty cool and profound, and just this real opportunity to build relationships and work together.
That's interesting. So you find that differently. So for example, the United States is very, as an individualistic, very transactional culture broadly relative to, say, the UK. You can say this in the UK because in the United States, how the government works is you basically, you go talk to your congressperson and they go advocate and all this sort of stuff. And it works completely differently in the UK system. It's like, which aristocracy are you from, or like which relationships you have to how you can influence how things are done. It's not as like commercial and pragmatic, but I find that to be like more relational than American culture, but you seem to experience it differently.
Where I grew up, Southeast London, an area called Greenwich, working was mainly in the central part of London. That's where all the financial district of London is based. And I found it to be quite transactional. I was a few months away from quitting recruitment altogether in 2014 because I spent years trying to, I'm not saying it's impossible to build relationships. You can build relationships, but there is an element of transaction in the relationship beyond the actual transaction of the doing business together. The relationships it's hard to get to a point where it becomes quite enjoyable to work together and achieve a common goal. Whereas in America, what I learned is within a few months of being in the country and working with clients and customers and candidates and investors, if you do really good work, doors open for you. Whereas I found in London, it's far more difficult to do that. And I think even with London, they tried to build Silicon Roundabout, which you probably don't even know about, where they tried to create a tech center. It's not necessarily the same. And I know many people are going to disagree with me on this, especially people from the UK. On this comment, I really believe that there is something truly transformational and special about Silicon Valley that is hard, at least if you're in tech or in venture capital, it's the place to be, right? It's like if you're in the acting business, you should be in Hollywood. If you're playing soccer or football, you should be probably in the UK or somewhere in Europe. That's how I think about it. I think in our world, whether you're an engineer or a coder or a recruiter or an investor in the space of technology, you should probably be in Silicon Valley. That's should be boots on the ground in the area.
I think that's certainly true. We chose to stay here. I mean, there was, as you recall, during COVID, there was a feeling that one should leave here, and it got pretty apocalyptic at that time, especially in San Francisco. We made the conscious decision to stay for exactly that reason, and I think that turned out without question to be the right one.
I think one last thing I want to say about it is I had this very weird, odd conversation with you only a few weeks ago about tax, right? And if you go to a place like Florida or Texas where state tax is very different to maybe like in California, in my opinion, at least on this, is you can hinder innovation if you're just trying to be somewhere because it's more tax efficient, but really the place you should be, whilst the taxes are higher, you have access to the capital, to the customers, to networking, to meeting people. So I feel like there's something really special about California and the Silicon Valley. And as you said, people definitely tried to make that move to Miami and Austin and found themselves coming back.
I think maybe there's a bit of penny wise, pound foolish argument that one could make. Now, if you don't want to pay like $1 billion in taxes or something, I can understand, probably makes more sense, but access to the financial infrastructure in Silicon Valley is
I guess if you're getting to that stage where you're paying $1 billion in taxes, you've probably made it already by that point, right?
Yeah, you're already at legacy company stage.
You're already a legacy company. That's it. One last question I wanted to ask you. It really has been enjoyable having you on, Spence. One last question I'd like to ask you is, as far as the transformation that we're seeing with technology, the speed is changing constantly. I mean, if we look back in 23 and 24, things were moving relatively quickly, but now it's as if you go 2 weeks away on vacation, you come back, a lot has changed.
100%. I think we've got a team that's worked 21 days straight right now working on a release that we're working on. There's a great book by Daniel Yergin called The Prize that's about the oil industry in the early days. And if you go read, what the oil industry was like in the 1880s and 1890s, somebody would strike oil in Texas and then immediately there would be 100 prospectors, 1,000 prospectors trying to dig oil wells, and a town would go up, and it was just 24/7. And I think that's characteristic of a speculative frenzy. And we're in a speculative frenzy right now. So, if you're not one of the 1,000 prospectors that goes in and digs a well when somebody just struck oil, then you're going to lose. So, if you are on vacation when they strike oil, then you lose. So that's characteristic of the moment that we're in right now.
It's a race. Yeah, absolutely. You're 10 years in with LILT. What does the future look like?
Well, for us, what I'm really excited about is we've got some product releases coming this fall with around agents. And I think we're going to be able to go into every sector of the economy and help businesses. I mean, the mission of our company is to democratize access to information and make it possible for every business to be able to operate globally. Just like every person should be able to travel, have opportunity, learn about culture, interact with people. Every business, if it wants to go do business in this country, in Japan or Germany or France, it should have the ability to go do that. And communication and language is crucial to that ability to go to market in those regions. And for our government customers, it means we should be safe. Our government should have the information tools that they need to keep us safe. And increasingly, we're in information wars with our adversaries. And so for us, that means I think what agents allows us to do is to go into more and more of these parts of the economy and very hairy and thorny use cases that are services right now that people do. And they're still in a very important role for people as experts. But a lot of the tedious work, going back to the CRM example, clicking 15 times so you can fill out one form, we can build agentic workflows that can alleviate that tedium and then enable those people to focus on the real job to be done, which for our information warriors is analysis and intelligence gathering. For people who are in business, it's strategic thinking and decision making versus spending a bunch of time filling out forms and dealing with enterprise software.
Spence, how has working with the government, how does working with the government, how does it affect the trajectory of a startup and its culture?
We're a dual use company, so we do commercial and government versus being like a pure defense tech. And man, I think it's a completely different sales cycle. For us, it's pretty much the same product, but that's changing pretty rapidly. You got to have the right capital structure because it's a much lumpier deal cycle. It's hard to grow really fast in the government. So you've got to be able to do some upfront investment for a longer term payoff and competitive moat. And that's why we chose to do it. It's a business decision. We thought it was a really defensible part of the market that we were uniquely capable of accessing, which I think has turned out to be true. But boy, has it been an up and down ride. Thankfully, it's on the up.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because I speak to a few founders who have products that they sell into government, and what they've told me is, because I'm always curious why go into it if it's the big upfront investment, the sales cycles are longer. And some founders have said to me, whilst the sales life cycles are longer and the investment, upfront investment is a lot more, once you're in, you're in. It's a lot harder to come out.
That's a lifetime value argument. So the lifetime value of a customer that you acquire is higher. You've got to have capital that has that medium to long-term perspective versus a very short-term perspective.
Spence, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I didn't realize the hour already went by. We always end this show with a question pertaining to a book recommendation. You mentioned one earlier. This is a show that's called Inside the Silicon Mind because, as I said, it's all about education. It's all about getting into the minds of Silicon Valley leaders. So as a leader in Silicon Valley, as a founder and a CEO, is there a book out there that you've read, one that you would recommend to our listeners and our viewers, whether it's a founder or an engineer or an investor, but someone who's in our industry?
I'll recommend my favorite book. So my favorite book is called The Mountains of My Life. It was written in the 1950s, I think, by Walter Bonatti, who was an Italian alpinist. And it's his climbing exploits in the early days of alpinism in the 50s and 60s. I'm a technical scuba diver, sort of like he was going up, I go down. I think there's a lot of leadership lessons to be learned from these types of activities where you basically take your life in your own hands. And if something happens, you're responsible for it. There's nobody else that you can blame. If you've chosen to try to climb a mountain and you fall off the mountain, there's nobody to blame but you for that. And I think that maybe is some of the best coaching for what it feels like to be a founder and a CEO, that the buck's stops with you and there's nobody else to blame. That's my favorite book. And I think there's a lot to learn from the type of mindset that it takes to be able to take that type of risk.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Thank you for that recommendation. And we'll have that in the show notes. I think being a founder is definitely not an easy feat. And it's full of all the ups and downs and responsibilities that come with it's the market, it's your employees, your investors. Really the buck ends with you. Spence, again, thank you so much. It really has been a pleasure. Thanks for making the time today to be on the show. I'd love to do this again at some point in person.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Appreciate it.
This podcast was brought to you by Serana Labs and powered by Harrison Clark. At Harrison Clark, we're at the heart of Silicon Valley's evolution and at the intersection of search and venture, funding the companies shaping the future and connecting them to the most elite cloud, data, and AI talent. To learn more, visit harrisonclark.com. If today's episode challenged your thinking, then share it with someone who's driving innovation. For even more insights on achieving product market fit, subscribe to our newsletter, The PMF Playbook, where we break down the journey from zero to product market fit. Visit thepmfplaybook.com. For more episodes, follow us on social media or visit insidethesiliconmind.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay consistent, and stay inside the Silicon Mind. See you soon.